In the quiet Kansas county of Sanford, the land stretched like an old quilt, patched and stitched, brown with memory, golden with grain. Each mile told a story of generations, dust-stained photographs on farmhouse walls, barbed wire fences that once marked boundaries of pride, and barns leaning slightly like they, too, remembered better years. Roy Caldwell's land lay just south of the Riverbend turnoff, 60 acres of stubborn earth and rusted hope. From the sky, it might have looked unremarkable, flat fields and weathered structures, but on the ground, it held something deeper. History rooted itself here. His grandfather had plowed the same rows behind a mule, his father behind a tractor, and Roy, now at 76, drove the same narrow paths each morning on an old John Deere that coughed and sputtered but never failed him. While the rest of Riverbend bowed to time and change, selling their farms to a company that promised luxury homes and artificial lakes, Roy remained. The others had packed moving vans, taken checks with trembling hands, and disappeared behind tinted windows and far-off plans. They had traded creaking porches for marble countertops, wild deer for golf greens, and silence for the hum of development. One by one, neighbors became memories, fields became construction zones, and old roads turned into cul-de-sacs. But Roy stayed. He lived alone now in the same white farmhouse where he and his wife, Esther, had raised their daughter. Time had softened the wood siding and cracked the paint, but it had not touched the rhythm inside. Morning still began with coffee brewed over a stove too old to be fashionable and eggs gathered from the last 5 hens he kept more for the sound of them than their yield. He read the obituaries first in the paper, out of habit, not morbid interest, and studied the weather like it might still surprise him. Since Esther passed, the silence had thickened. Her absence filled the corners of every room, her apron still hanging by the pantry door, her handwriting still labeling jars of jam long past their date. Their daughter, Susan, called every other Sunday from Denver, always urging him to sell, to move in with her, to find a smaller place, closer to hospitals. She never raised her voice, but each call ended the same, with Roy staring out the window at the barn, his answer unspoken but certain. He feared the world she lived in, quick, bright, loud. What he feared more was what he'd leave behind. Every fence post on his land had a story. Every grove of trees, every worn tire track across the pasture. His wife had been buried just outside the western field, beneath the sycamore where they'd once carved their initials. Moving meant leaving her. Leaving meant forgetting. The offers came regularly. Glossy envelopes with return addresses from Brickwell Development, promising figures Roy didn't care to read. They talked of community growth, of modern living, of opportunity. He saw only bulldozers and silence. He tossed each letter into the old wood stove without a second thought. The men came next, clean boots, firm handshakes, practiced smiles. They walked the perimeter of his land with tablets and maps, as if planning a conquest. They spoke of things like green space and investment potential and inevitable change. Roy said little. He'd long since learned that silence was a kind of armor. His refusal wasn't loud or angry. It wasn't about politics or protest. It was grief. It was memory. It was love, held in soil and seeds and things that never made the news. Each day followed the same cadence. Roy rose before the sun, dressed slowly, the way he had since the army, and walked the line of his fence to check for breaks. He fed the chickens, tossed corn for the wild deer that gathered at dawn, and brought fresh water to the barn cat that had decided to stay. Then he climbed onto his tractor and rode the same paths through fields that no longer yielded what they once had, but still gave him something, purpose. Afternoons were quieter. He sat on the porch with a thermos of coffee and listened to the wind. Sometimes he read, but more often he just watched the changing light, tracked the clouds, and let his thoughts wander to years gone by. On Sundays, he took a walk to the edge of the western field, knelt beneath the sycamore, and cleared the dry leaves from the grave marker. The simple stone bore Esther's name and a line he had chosen himself: "Love is the only harvest worth tending." As the weeks passed and the developers closed in, Roy's land stood like a thumbprint against the plans. New roads looped around his borders, equipment moved like armies across former pastures, and concrete foundations rose where wheat once bowed in the wind. But within the fences of Caldwell Farm, everything remained untouched. He became a curiosity. Drones buzzed overhead sometimes. Real estate agents whispered about him in town. The locals who once worked the land stopped waving. To many, he was holding up progress. To others, he was a ghost refusing to fade. But Roy paid them no mind. He had lived long enough to know that noise passes. The land stays. And so each night, he returned to the porch as the sun dipped low, its orange light spilling across furrowed fields. He wrapped himself in the silence, listened for the wind in the grass, and held on to the one thing no one could build over or tear down. Memory. When the last neighbor's truck disappeared down County Line Road, Roy Caldwell didn't mark the moment. There was no farewell, no wave from the porch. Only the soft echo of tires over gravel and the slow return of silence. The village of Riverbend had been emptied one family at a time. The Perkins were the first, 3 generations packed into a rental truck, their weathered barns sold off for parts. Then came the Alvarezes, their orchard bulldozed before the ink dried on the contract. Even the McAllisters, who once vowed they'd never sell, finally left one August morning without so much as a goodbye. Roy had watched them go from the far field, a thermos in hand, the sunrise behind him casting his shadow long across the grass. It wasn't bitterness that filled him, but something quieter. A kind of quiet grief that didn't need words. With each departure, the isolation grew. At first, he could still count the distant hum of tractors, the bark of neighbor dogs, the voices of children riding bikes down the narrow lanes. But soon the sounds were replaced by the mechanical thrum of construction, the clang of steel, and the sharp beep of reversing trucks. Where fields once breathed with wind and grain, now bulldozers crawled like beetles across broken earth. Roy kept to his routines. He woke each morning at 5, made coffee, and pulled on his boots. The barn still needed sweeping, and the hens still laid their eggs. He checked the fence line, walked the southern pasture, and fed the cat who had taken to sleeping on Esther's old rocking chair. Each task gave him structure. Each hour kept the loneliness from settling too deep into his bones. But it was different now. The roads he once used to get to town had been rerouted. A construction sign blocked the path where he used to drive his pickup for supplies. The new road looped wide around the development perimeter, adding 15 minutes to every errand. And the new gas station on the corner didn't stock the feed he needed. The cashier there didn't even look up when Roy asked about deliveries. Even nature seemed to shrink back. Deer stopped grazing near the edges. Birds that once nested in his eaves moved on. The sky above remained wide, but it felt heavier somehow. As if the land itself knew it was being changed. His daughter called more often now. Susan's voice carried that blend of concern and frustration that only comes from love stretched across too many miles. She asked if he was eating, if he needed money, if he was safe. She asked him to consider selling, not for the money, but for the peace. She offered her guest room in Denver, reminded him that her boys missed their grandfather, that he could start over. She always meant well. Roy listened. He thanked her. And each time, when the call ended, he placed the phone back on its cradle and stared out the window, waiting for the sound of the wind to return. He didn't want to start over. He had started here. He remembered the exact day he and Esther moved into the house, June 3, 1969. The lilacs were in bloom. They planted their first tomato patch behind the barn and built the chicken coop with salvaged wood from her father's shed. They had their daughter in that house, argued in that kitchen, patched the roof after storms, and once spent an entire summer sleeping on the screened porch because the bedroom fan had broken and they were too stubborn to buy a new one. Leaving that behind wasn't just about memory. It was about meaning. He had stopped going into town unless necessary. The stairs were too much. He could hear the conversation stop when he walked into the hardware store. He noticed the glances, half pity, half annoyance. The last holdout. The old man who refused to let progress move forward. Some even said he was selfish. But Roy didn't respond. He just tipped his hat, paid in cash, and left quietly. Sometimes, he received mail addressed only to the farmer. Most were offers, some kind, some not. One letter accused him of slowing down growth. Another said he was keeping jobs from being created. A few were kind, handwritten notes from strangers thanking him for standing his ground. He kept those tucked into the family Bible, between pages marked by his wife's old pressed flowers. But most days brought no mail at all. The world, it seemed, had moved on. Even the land around him had begun to look different. The horizon had changed. Instead of barns and silos, there were now steel frames and cranes. Instead of crop rows, there were skeletons of houses, black tarps pinned down like stitches across wounded earth. And the sky, once a canvas of shifting color, was now blurred by dust and machinery. Roy still worked his field. Not for profit, not for yield, but because it gave him something to care for. He planted oats that he knew might not grow, mended fences that no longer marked anything, and painted the old porch swing though no one ever sat on it. He ate alone. Slept alone. Walked the fields with only the wind and the cat as his companions. Yet he didn't feel broken. He felt resolved. The world might call it isolation. But to Roy, it was stewardship. It was love lived out through labor. And in every furrowed row, every swept barn floor, every quiet morning with a thermos and the sunrise, he was still connected to those who came before and to something deeper than ownership. The land remembered. And so would he. That evening, when the ribbon had been cut and the speeches were done, when the tractors had rolled away and the families returned to their homes, Roy Caldwell sat alone on the porch he'd refused to abandon. The same porch where he had once watched neighbors drive away, where he'd waited for the storm to pass, where he had spent decades with a thermos and the silence. Now, the silence was different. It wasn't empty anymore. From where he sat, he could see them, people in the fields, not in suits or hard hats, but in jeans and flannel, hands deep in garden beds, children running between rows of vegetables, laughter rising like birdsong. There was smoke from a fire pit near the old barn where a group of teenagers roasted marshmallows. Near the edge of the land, two elders bent over soil with trowels, planting something new where the wild grass used to grow. The farm hadn't changed, not in its soul. But around it, everything had shifted. The wooden sign nailed to the gate had been painted by a child, crude letters, bright colors. Caldwell Commons, land that remembers. Below it, a simple line in smaller type, in honor of those who stayed when it was hardest. The living agricultural center Nathan had proposed was no longer just an idea. It breathed. The land, once threatened by development, had become a gathering place for knowledge and nourishment. Students from the city came in buses to learn how to compost. Local families rented small plots to grow food they couldn't afford in stores. Veterans found healing here, tending the land with hands that had once held rifles. No one asked questions. No one judged. Roy didn't run the show. He didn't want to. He was the caretaker, the living reminder that stillness had value, that a single refusal could bloom into renewal. The farm ran on shared effort now, but it moved at the old pace, sunrise to sunset, guided by the seasons, not by spreadsheets. He still woke early, still tended to the chickens, still brewed his coffee the same way. The house remained modest, untouched by renovation. The swing creaked in the same slow rhythm. But people stopped by now. They left pies on the porch. Notes. Seeds in envelopes. A small girl from the new housing circle had painted him a rock shaped like a heart. He kept it by the window. There had been no fanfare the day Nathan Brickwell handed him a coin, something heavy and worn, taken from his own father's keepsake box. It wasn't flashy. Just a dull bronze medallion etched with a tree and the words, "Steadfast in the storm." Nathan hadn't said much. He hadn't needed to. The coin sat now in Roy's coat pocket, where he sometimes pressed his thumb against it during long walks. The people who had once called him a problem now brought their children to learn from him. A plaque had been added to the base of the sycamore tree, where Esther lay. This ground was never empty, it was waiting. The tree had grown tall, its branches stretching wide, shading the bench beneath it. Roy went there often, sitting in the late afternoon light, watching the wind ripple through the wheatgrass they had reseeded around the hill. Sometimes he closed his eyes and imagined her beside him, still humming, still alive in the warmth of the soil, and the joy returned to the land. The mayor visited that summer with a camera crew and a proclamation. Roy stood in front of the barn, surrounded by neighbors and newcomers alike. The ceremony was short. But when the mayor handed him the document and stepped back, something unexpected happened. Silence. Not the kind Roy had lived with for years. Not the silence of abandonment or forgetting. This was the silence of recognition. The crowd didn't clap right away. They stood still. Heads bowed. As if realizing, all at once, what they were standing on. What it had taken to keep it here. Even the children stilled. It was like silence was saying more than words could. Afterwards, the laughter returned, and Roy slipped away from the center. He preferred to watch from the edges. Always had. A boy approached him near the barn. The same boy who once stood beside his father, stuck in the flood. Now older. Taller. He handed Roy a framed photo, one taken that night, 2 years earlier. Roy and Nathan, soaked and shivering, inside the farmhouse. A candle between them. The frame had a note etched in the wood: "Some people save land. Some save lives. You did both." As the sun began to sink below the horizon, Roy returned to his porch. The coffee in his thermos was lukewarm, but he didn't mind. The porch steps creaked as the barn cat curled up beside his boot. The air smelled like rain and fresh earth. And the fields, lit by the soft gold of dusk, looked exactly as they always had. But now, they held more than memories. They held promise. He thought about the generations that would walk these rows, about the children who would plant their first seeds here, about the soil that would carry more than crops, it would carry story. Legacy. Roots. For a long while, he sat without moving. Just listening. To the wind. To the voices in the distance. To the whisper of land that had been heard, not buried. It wasn't a victory anyone would read about in papers. No headlines. No medals. But it was enough. He hadn't fought the future. He had waited for it to remember. And when it did, it brought with it the people who needed the land as much as he did. Kindness without question is enough. It always was.